You have reached review time with Imperial. Today's review will be Fantasy Island. This is a Bloomhouse film. They do a lot of like horror type movies. Let's get into it. So the cast, pretty much the most notable cast is Michael Pena. He plays as Mr. Rourke, and Jimmy O Yang. He plays as Brax. And if you don't know Jimmy O Yang, he's been playing in a lot of different movies where, I didn't see him in a lot of different films. But most notably that I remember him in was Silicon Valley as Chen in there. So that's probably the notable actors that I seen in here. Also, Michael Rooker, he plays as Damon. That's also a familiar actor. He played in movies like Galaxy of the Guardian, and he also played at the Walking Dead TV series as Myrtle, Daryl Dixon's brother. So let's get into the movie. So the movie came out, and you didn't know what to expect. So it's people who have fantasies who go to this island to live out their fantasy. Whatever the fantasy may be, they live it out. And they got to live it all the way out. So that means you might have a fantasy, but doesn't necessarily mean it's going to turn out good. It could be a fantasy that turns out bad. So in the course of all these, it starts off with someone already going through this fantasy, and she's getting killed. So she pretty much thinks she's going to get free, and then she's end up talking to the person who's runs the island. And so that's how it starts off and gets you right into the mode of the movie. So these group of people show up, and less than no time their fantasies start to occur, and each character has their own different fantasy, and they can't tell whether it's real or if it's the fantasy. And so what eventually happens is their fantasies start to intertwine, and they all want out of their fantasies. They realize that that they don't want to go through the consequences of the fantasies is not worth going through the fantasies no more. So while the fantasies start to intertwine with each other, you have a rogue employee of the island who's out there, who's trying to help them get free from the island. However, because the fantasies are intertwining, he ended up getting killed, saving two of the girls that were part of the fantasy. Now, one girl, she had a fantasy, and then the other girl was part of her fantasy, and she was lying, saying like she just got kidnapped, and they both were kidnapped, but she broke loose and she freed her. And those characters, that was pretty much Melanie. She's the character. She had the fantasy, and then she wanted Sloane was always torturing her during high school, and she wanted revenge. And then when she started to get revenge, she didn't want it no more. And so everybody's fantasy started to intertwine. You had Brax Weaver, that's played by Jimmy Chang, and his brother JD Weaver. Their fantasy was to be able to live life and do whatever they wanted to do. However, when you have everything in the world, people want to come and get it. So that's what ended up happening with their fantasy. Somebody wanted to come in and steal everything they had, and so they had to deal with like a militia group out to take their goods and stuff. So then you had another Patrick. He had a fantasy where he never when he was young, his dad went off to the military and then died in the war, and he always wanted to have a relationship with his dad. So his fantasy was he ended up meeting his dad as an adult, and he had explained to his dad that who he was, but the dad, once he intervened, pretty much was like, nah, like if I'm not gonna live, I want to change. He had to let him know that you a hero, so you got to go out like this. And then they got their little thing back and forth. And then you had a who was the other woman in there? Her name was it was another woman. Her fantasy was where she took a man and he proposed to her, and she shouldn't have denied him, and she regretted that. So she always wanted to go back and live that moment, and this time not decline his proposal when he proposed to her. So when she went through this time around, when she went through it, the very next day, it fast forward 5 years of her life, where now she has a 5-year-old, and the 5-year-old, she had like a little disconnect with the 5-year-old. So she like, this can't be real. And then the guy who owns the island, Mr. Rourke, came out and pretty much saying, yo, this is your fantasy and you just got to live it through. So as long as the people live out their fantasies, they're good. But as soon as they start trying to change things or reject it, things go south. So pretty much there's a woman on the island who is like an employee that you think she's an employee, but when you hear Mr. Rourke's story, his story is when he came upon this island, pretty much his thing was he wanted to when he came across this island, he heard about it when he finally found the island. His wife passed away, and his request was to bring his wife back together, bring his wife back alive, so that he'd have her forever. And so as long as he stayed at the island and kept the island going, his wish will always stay true. But his wife was like having like rejections of it, but thinking, she not knowing what the real situation was. And so the wife ended up helping one of the guests and helped her to stay alive, and that broke the whole curse, and everybody's fantasy, like I said before, intertwined. So from there, they end up finding out that the Melanie character, she was really the first one to ever go to the fantasy island. Her fantasy island is really what drummed everybody's fantasy together, and she wanted to go through all these things. And so after she did that, they found out she was really the main culprit of everything. A couple of the characters died, and the main girl that Melanie wanted to torture, she drunk some water, and pretty much her fantasy was to get Melanie out of there. They got Melanie out of there, and then they all wanted to leave the island. But you had Patrick Sullivan, his fantasy really was that he wanted to die in war like his father. So he ended up, to save them, he ended up jumping on a grenade like his dad passed away, to save all of them. And then you had Brax Weaver. He saved his brother. His brother actually died, but his fantasy was to his brother had a family back home, so he didn't really. So his fantasy was to have his brother come back to life and leave and go on with his family. Meanwhile, he stayed at the island. So other than that, it was a decent movie. Not gonna say a must watch, but it doesn't hurt to watch it if you got the opportunity and you're looking for something to watch. And my 4-star rating system, I'm gonna give it it wasn't bad, so I wanna give this a two 2 out of 4 stars. It wasn't a bad movie. It's, you know, if you don't got nothing else to watch during quarantine and you home, why not? It'll keep you in tune. Till next time. Oh yeah, subscribe and like to the channel.